If you have to spend a bunch of time doting on your sick wife in the hospital, then you're probably going to have to drink a lot of crappy coffee. They don't sell the good stuff there. It's serviceable at best. Oh, wait a minute. No, there are coffee shops on the main floors of hospitals, aren't there? I'm thinking of the old days where there's that machine, that sludge. Oh, well. I'm wrong. Let's get to the point, though. When you get home and try to relax after those trying times in the house of the ill, you should start pouring Spark Plug coffee into your receptacle. Spark Plug provides premium quality beans, the best coffee you've ever brewed, in fact. It'll be delivered right to your door, if you're a non-Mexican North American, that is. And we Canadians will enjoy free shipping. Isn't that convenient? Isn't that affordable? It's certainly cheaper and better on your tongue and in your belly than takeout is. Here's a helpful suggestion. Join Spark Plug's Autopilot Coffee Club. Pause or even cancel any time, especially if you're about to die, and you probably won't need premium beans much longer. A little longer. You know, you want them around in case you come back to life.
Listen, if I'm going to die soon, I want to be drinking the good stuff.
But after that, you don't need them anymore. Unless you come back as a ghost and you want coffee. The website is sparkplug.coffee/HYES. Go there, give it a try, and find your new favorite. That HYES part I mentioned, that's the code you use to get a one-time 20% discount. Well, we love Spark Plug and their coffee, but we're about to talk about a movie with that word in the title, love. Let's get to it.
And action. Have you ever seen
Love Story? Happy day, preppies of Barrett Hall and film fans around the world. And thank you from Harvard to Radcliffe for downloading or streaming the 644th episode that anyone with thumbs can access on Have You Ever Seen? Or forefingers, pinkies. We sail back into the movie past, or drive our sports cars back in the movie past, and talk about whatever interests us in spoiler-drenched fashion. I'm the guy who has said sorry more times than you can count, Ryan Ellis III. And here's the lady who often rides a bike and likes to wear red, just like Allie MacGraw, my wife, Bev.
That's me.
We continue with Old Love Month today. We're calling it that because every movie we're reviewing this February is very old. Most of them predate even me, and I'll be 51 years old in a few days. I'll be 51 years old. Okay, the coming attractions trivia question for A Love Story, and this requires a spoiler alert for two other movies. Contrary to what you might think, the top 10 on the AFI's Top 100 Passions list actually has a lot of failed romances. Most of the couples don't even end up together in those films. But in 3 cases, including Love Story, at least one half of the couple dies. Here's the spoiler. What are the other 2 films? Hang on. Spoiler. They're fast-forwarding maybe or muting. Go ahead.
They are West Side Story. I don't know if that's unspoiled for literally anybody still, but Tony dies in West Side Story, and Dr. Zhivago. Laura doesn't make it to the end of that movie.
Incorrect. It's Yuri that dies.
She's never seen or heard from again, isn't she?
Well, maybe she's dead too, but they're both in the street, and he can't quite reach out, oh my God, Laura, and she doesn't hear him, and he just does that weird, wah, and he collapses on the street and dies.
I love the ambiguous ending that she just disappeared and you say,
but you're right. She must be dead because Alec Guinness is talking to her daughter, I think.
Yeah.
Maybe their daughter, but at least
who's
her
a devoted communist. Been raised on the propaganda.
We saw that movie for the podcast so long ago, I forgot all about these elements right now. But anyway, he definitely dies. I guess she does too. And of course, Jenny in Love Story does not make it out, which is probably not much of a spoiler either because who doesn't know that? Well, maybe some people don't. Okay, sorry. Canadian version of saying sorry, was released by Paramount Pictures 55 years ago on December 16th, 1970. And my word, did it rake in money. It was number 1 at the box office for many weeks in late 1970 and into the early days of 1971. The film was also number 1 at the box office that year, ahead of 2 films we covered a long time ago, also for the podcast in the Top 100 Project days. MASH, which was number 3, and Patton, which was the Best Picture winner, and it was number 4. In fact, those 3 films all competed for Best Picture with 5 Easy Pieces and something I'm forgetting. But Bev, this movie is a geezer, so please give us the skinny on Love Story.
Ryan O'Neill and Allie MacGraw are Oliver and Jenny, 2 undergrads studying at Harvard and Radcliffe. Jenny is a sassy, smart, working-class girl with a passion for music and a scholarship. Oliver is a wealthy jock struggling with the pressure of living up to his very imposing father. The 2 fall madly in love, despite having nothing in common. Oliver's father tries to talk him out of marrying Jenny, so Oliver disowns him, and the newlyweds have to struggle to put him through law school. When he graduates 3rd in his class, they start their life in Manhattan just in time to find out Jenny has a terminal illness. She dies at the end.
Yes. We know what the illness is. It couldn't be AIDS. I'm afraid it's probably cancer. They don't say specifically.
In the book, it's leukemia. They make it clear.
Okay.
They figured out she has cancer from blood tests and then sent her to a hematologist, which is a blood specialist. But she still has a full head of hair and a flush complexion on her deathbed. Is it Roger Ebert says she died of being like terminally pretty or something?
Got prettier as the movie went along.
Yeah.
Maybe not quite prettier, but not much worse looking. Well, 2 comments I can make about that. One is that she died beautifully, dying with prettiness. But the other one is the line, I may be misquoting it, but I think it's Ann Jackson. She was in the AFI special for the Passions list. And she said about the old Garbo movies that she was always dying in a key light. And Camille and something else she did, maybe Queen Christina, one of those kinds of movies. Dying in a key light, looking beautiful. Well, that certainly applies to Ali MacGraw in Love Story. Or in a nutshell, it's the age-old story. Young couple moves to New York, and then one of them ends up dead. You should have stayed in Boston, and she would have been fine.
Tale as old as time.
Don't go to Manhattan. Actually, we liked Boston when we were there a couple years ago, but as we've said so many times in this podcast, we love New York our 2 times, and we're going again one day. So I'm just trying to be funny there because I prefer New York myself. All right, the numbers on this movie, and there are a lot of them to talk about. Rotten Tomatoes critics aren't great on it, but it is a fresh tomato. Not by much, though. 63%, so barely a fresh tomato. 19 reviews that are fresh and 11 that are rotten, so the average is 6 out of 10. Makes sense. But the audience is not as strong as you might think for this blockbuster, but 75% of them liked it, or like it. Arthur Hiller, who directed this movie, didn't direct the sequel. Hiller's most successful movie critically is The Hospital, which he made the year after this, maybe, with George C. Scott.
It was a bigger hit than Love
Not
Story?
a hit, no, critically acclaimed.
Oh, okay.
Rotten Tomatoes. I believe that's with George C. Scott, who was in Patton. So they competed the year before in a way. Well, it was Best Actor, Best Director, but still they competed at the Oscars the next year. I think it was him, where he makes a movie with them, and it's his best reviewed film of all time.
Maybe they met at all those Oscars events and then decided to do a project together.
And as I recall, it was a comedy or even this has got funny elements in it here and there.
It's
but
lighthearted at times.
It was a satire, at least that was. The Hospital, that is. Okay. Oh, there you go, too. The Hospital, that's the end of this movie. And then it's the whole point of the next one he made, Hiller. The sequel, Oliver's Story in 1978, was with Ryan O'Neal, not surprisingly, and Ray Milland, the only 2 people from this that are in that. Jenny was not a ghost. And it's only at 25% on Rotten Tomatoes. And in that, he's romancing Candice Bergen. This movie is 41st on Box Office Mojo's adjusted for inflation list. The thing is, they stopped updating that several years ago. And I've mentioned that many times the last few years, but Dan Merle, one of my favorite online people, mentioned that they don't update it anymore. Because I'm looking and thinking, but there are a lot of movies like Barbie that would have surpassed these other things. And that's why that number is probably not accurate. It isn't accurate anymore, 41st, but that's what it says on Box Office Mojo.
Still
so let's
astounding.
say it's 60. Maybe
Still
it's more like
astounding.
that, yeah. Even 75, even if it's that high. For a small budget movie with 2 not really big names, I wouldn't say. Hiller wasn't a huge name director. This did win an Oscar for Francis Lay's original music score. That piano music, if you know it, you're never going to forget it. This was also nominated for 6 more. Best Picture, Arthur Hiller for Best Director. Ryan O'Neal for Best Actor. Yeah, okay. Ali MacGraw for Best Actress. Wow. What? John Marley for Best Supporting Actor. Okay, he was pretty good as the dad. And Eric Siegel's original screenplay. I would have nominated for any of those awards.
Yeah, me neither.
Marley was quite good and quite nice, and then he plays the jerk producer in The Godfather a couple years later, so obviously a Paramount picture also. If he had played that first and then played this, I could see people saying, oh my God, what range he showed, but in a way the range was later. This was 13th on the AFI's Top 100 Quotes with the line, you say it,
Love means never having to say you're sorry.
one of the dumbest lines of all time, and in the top 15 you got 2 of my least favorite famous quotes, because number 1, I think, I'm pretty sure it's number 1, is, no, that's frankly my dear, don't give a damn.
Yeah.
It's in the top 10, I think, though. Maybe I'm wrong. After all, tomorrow is another day. Yes, it's always another day. And love means never having
It's
to say...
expressing optimism.
Oh, God.
And setting your sights for the future,
but
Ryan.
this line, when you love somebody, you're more apt to apologize if you're not a monster.
Oh, no. Everybody
So dumb.
has lampooned this line, including Ali MacGraw and even fans of this movie. Eric Siegel and Arthur Hiller defended it. He said it was meant to say, if you love somebody, you understand they're not perfect, and they don't have to apologize for every little thing they do that's not perfect. And he called it an affirmation of the human spirit, and went on to talk about how that time in history, the late 60s, early 70s, was so divisive, and trying to say, like, you can be mad at somebody and still love them. But of course, that message falls pretty flat when, A, you have to show contrition to be forgiven, The message falls pretty flat when you consider that Oliver never makes amends with his father, who he may disagree with, but I think we can agree is not a bad person exactly, and that Oliver Sr., while he's wrong about Jenny, he really thought he was doing what was best for Oliver. He was not just being a hater. But the movie's completely against those two reconciling. As a matter of fact, it ends with this big F-U, where he's like, yeah, well, she's dead, and then he runs off.
And O'Neill says the line to him.
Yeah, love means never having to say you're sorry. What are you talking about? First of all, he's expressing his condolences, so what are you actually talking about? But he's just a mess, and he takes
His dad
off.
went to the hospital to try to help.
Yes!
He says, I'm here to help. Well, it's too late. She's dead.
Even if that was the intention, it's a pretty, A, poor execution, B, terrible phrasing, because everyone misinterprets it, and there's nothing else in the film to address that division that he's talking about.
Yet somehow the AFI, when they did their quotes list, I don't remember what year it was, but it was sometime in the 2000s, they rank it 13th. Even though this has been said for decades at that point. And they also parodied it, not the next movie he made, maybe it was
in What's Up, Doc?
But in What's Up, Doc, one of the next movies that O'Neill made was Streisand, where she says that on a plane, I think, at the end, in more of a wise-ass way, and he says, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Or maybe he says it, anyway, it is said, and one of them mocks the line, thank God, only a couple years after it was in this famous movie. This was 9th on the AFI's Top 100 Passions, and it was nominated for 4 more lists. The Top 100 Cheers, Most Inspiring. All right. The Top 25 Music Scores. That makes sense. I don't love the score. It's a little overplayed. The love story theme is too much, but it's a good theme. It's like the Loris theme, actually, in Dr. Zhivago. Great theme, but it plays too much. And then it was nominated for the 2 main lists, the 1998 and 2007 Top 100s, but didn't make that. You'd never seen it before? You knew she was going to die, I think, right, going in?
Yeah.
And then, of course, the very beginning of the movie.
First line, what do you say about a 25-year-old girl who dies?
Yes, exactly. So it's no big spoiler anyway. I've already warned people plenty about spoilers. What'd you think of Love Story?
I spent most of my research for this podcast just trying to answer the question of, why is it so popular?
You said to me it was over. I liked it.
I didn't hate it. And fair that there is an audience for this, but for this movie to be the hit that it was, and the book too, which critics all agreed was worse than the movie.
Yes, he wrote the book after he wrote the script.
Concurrently with the script,
No, after. He wrote the script and tried to sell it.
Yeah. They were like, turn this into a book.
And then different people, Robert
hit.
Evans, the studio head, said it was his idea. An agent or the producer of this movie said it was their idea. Anyway, he wrote the thing to try to promote the movie, and the book came out first.
But what is the appeal? It's adequately made. It's 2 gorgeous actors wearing gorgeous, stylish clothes and a beautiful setting. It's fast-paced, almost too fast-paced, actually. Yeah. The conflict is pretty low stakes and contrived. Their love feels less organic and more like an edict, because I don't understand why they would even like each other. Although the one thing that they do pull off as performers is that they're very into each other. They genuinely have a ton of chemistry. So aside from believable chemistry, their performances are weak. Ali MacGraw, she's very pretty. She's not a good actress.
If she was a mediocre-looking woman, we would not know her name.
No.
Never
O'Neill,
worth.
Passable. Better than her, at least, although I don't see what made him such a heartthrob.
He was a
for me.
huge star in the 70s, too, because What's Up, Doc, Barry Lyndon with Kubrick, and Paper Moon he did with his daughter Tatum, and she won the Oscar for that. That was between Barry Lyndon and What's Up, Doc, but that's 4 at least. There's probably more, but 4 very big titles in about 5 years this guy made. He was huge.
Yeah, and he was a heartthrob. Girls loved him. I don't see it. Her?
Right.
Arrested Development joke.
I'm not really a big fan of this movie, by the way, if I didn't make that clear already. I never was. We're covering this because it's an appropriate one to cover before Valentine's Day, 4 days from now.
It's a juggernaut of a movie, like a cultural juggernaut.
Well, I've got the list of AFI movies we've never covered in any of the various lists, passions, comedies, what have you. And as people probably know, I've been trying to hammer through those because they're reputable movies usually, and this is reputable. But if we were only covering stuff we want to really talk about that we really truly like, or at least that I like because you had never even seen it, we wouldn't have covered this. And I don't like it any more than before. I'm surprised, as somebody who can get very emotional at movies a lot, maybe not so much when I'm with you, but still, even then, that this didn't, I can't say it didn't touch me, but I was nowhere near crying.
I choked up only when her dad is in the hospital in the hallway, and he says, I never should have promised her that I would be strong for you.
That was a nice exchange between him and
That is
O'Neill.
lovely, and that's the only moment where I got choked up at all. And then I was surprised to learn, she's supposed to have just died because she was talking up a storm. Yeah. She seemed to have energy and vim and vigor. What is happening? How is she dead now? I really wanted to answer the question of why this movie was popular. I think it must sit in the same space as movies like, well, I want to say Titanic, which is a movie I don't like, but I can at least admit it's a really well-made film.
And they are good actors.
What's that?
And they are good actors.
They are good actors. It's a cool story that appeals to men and women. I guess The Notebook, which I've just never seen because everybody who knows me and has seen The Notebook is like, Bev, don't watch that movie. But even something like Twilight, a movie that is laying on thick the fantasy fulfillment, appealing to young people, especially young women.
It's their love story.
Of course, there's lots of elements that are different. I watched the Twilight movies. I watched all of them for some reason. I think you did too, didn't you? They're terrible, but I still watched all 4 or 5 of them. And there was something bizarrely compelling about it, or even from the point of view of curiosity. And they were a phenomenon. So when Love Story came out, it was this massive hit. And we see it now, and it looks very old-fashioned. But to have these young actors and their style of their clothes and their hair was really very stylish.
She
really
was
very
sassy
young.
in a way that actors weren't very often.
Yeah.
Actresses weren't.
Yeah. You say, oh, she's sassy, and she talks back. As if Katharine Hepburn wasn't sassy and
She
talking
was one
back.
of the few that was doing that ever, though.
Yeah, but those movies were very popular. People liked her for that.
Yeah, but it was not common, and MacGraw doing that was different. Plus, this is the Vietnam era. The war was still going on, and here's something entirely different. This has nothing in common with Easy Rider.
It was very almost counter-programming to the other movies of its day that
And this
would have
is
been
more of a
considered
studio...
modern
That
for
was
that
obviously
generation.
independent. That was an independently made film that eventually got picked up by, I think, a big studio. I forget now. This was made by Paramount. Robert Evans has had the job for a few years. He'd made Rosemary's Baby. That was a big hit, I think, too. And certainly won Oscars, at least won an Oscar. He brought that studio back. Well, he and other people. He was also married to MacGraw. I think it was just the previous year he'd married her. She was his pet project, though. But she wasn't very good. She was in something like 9 movies ever. But 2 of them were monster hits. I believe The Getaway was a big hit, too. That's where she met Steve McQueen. And they had an affair because she was still married to Evans. And then she married him. They got divorced, too, before he died. But she only made 1 film before this. This is her second movie. Would this woman be known if it weren't for her looks? It's not like she's an awful actress.
Yeah.
But
She's
that's
not a
probably
movie
why
star.
I wasn't more moved. DiCaprio and Winslet, they're such great actors. They can make even terrible dialogue, which that movie had, sound okay. This dialogue's definitely better. One thing I liked about the movie, actually, is it's fairly authentic. They're outside in the cold, and I said this to you during the screening. Look at the breath the number of times it's coming out.
Wasn't this the first movie ever actually shot on Harvard
And
campus?
then it was, I think, the last, at least for a long time. Because
Well, they shot The Paper Chase on campus, didn't they?
I don't know if they did. I was reading about how...
Social Network does.
Well, that's 30, 40 years later. So a long time had passed. Harvard was mad. The people at Harvard that ran Harvard were mad at the way they treated the campus, I guess. And they must have been on Radcliffe's campus as well, and they're actually in Central Park in New York a lot of the time. They're outside a lot of the time. The cinematographer made this movie look pretty good. The DVD doesn't look that good. This is what we saw, the library DVD. He could have really used a Steadicam, but they didn't have them yet. It was about 5-6 years away from being invented because they're outside a lot. They're using tracks and dollies, obviously, and the camera's not all that smooth. But Hiller does have some pretty dynamic camera work when they're outside especially. So it had an authenticity to it, at least, by being in Boston on those campuses, and then a lot of it in New York in the last maybe third or so.
So you have modern style of shooting. You have young actors wearing of-the-moment fashions that would have appealed to young people. Swearing and the acknowledgement of premarital sex was considered very risque at the time. And then, of course, the unconventional wedding was probably a little shocking to some audiences. It was very modern for them to not get married in a church. She gets married in a short skirt.
And she's Catholic. She's Italian.
Yeah, and she's rejecting the church, so it's meant to appeal very much to that young generation. This movie still feels like counter-programming when you consider the other movies that were meant for youth. Now, critics look back at this time in cinema, and they're talking about Bonnie and Clyde and Easy Rider, MASH of the same year. These really counterculture movies that, of course, were incredibly influential. But how many more times have people saw Love Story than any of those movies?
Love Story's story is old-fashioned.
It's so
Love
old-fashioned.
Stories.
Yeah, that's kind of the point I'm
Filmmaking
driving
is not
to.
old-fashioned.
Yeah, I'm driving to the point that this is a very old-fashioned melodrama dressed up in the clothing of modernity. It's all the contradictions of second-wave feminism that women were pursuing education in record numbers at the time, but still abandoning the workforce, or at least letting it take a backseat for their families, because you can wear bell-bottoms, you can reject your stuffy old wealth family and their classist ideals, I should say, but ultimately has these very conservative, old-fashioned values. Jenny is so smart. She's talented. She's ambitious. It's part of why he loves her.
She gets a scholarship to Paris.
She gets a scholarship to Paris, and she gives it all up because he goes, oh, well, what if you married me? Just to keep her here, just to stop her from leaving for, 3 months?
I'm sure people would say, especially now, maybe even then, how dare he? But this wasn't a negative way of stopping her. This is, I love you, I don't want you to go.
And you could say, well, in 1970, that simply would have been like a normal thing to do.
Because the question could be, why can't he go study law?
Yeah, I feel like couples these days, there would be much more of a compromise, but he's afraid that if she leaves for 3 months, she's going to leave him forever. Or he's afraid that she's only going to leave because she really, and she says to him, Preppy, you know that this is temporary. We love each other, but you know you're going to dump me and marry one of your society girls that your dad wants you to marry. And he's like, no, I want to marry you. Let's get married. And then she immediately gives up her scholarship to go to France. She doesn't pursue any further education, even though there's this lip service that he says, well, I want her to go to Juilliard. She wants to have babies. So we're having babies. Why would she want to have babies more than she would want to go to Juilliard?
That. He says that to somebody.
He says, talking about, but you take it as honesty that they've had this conversation on screen.
He's not a liar, so you're probably right.
He's not a liar. And especially once they're married, they take care to include opportunities for him to... I guess it's progressive that he's like, I want her to go to school, but she wants to start a family, so we're starting a family. Being like, well, the missus wants it, so she's going to have it, even though it's very traditional, it's old school patriarchal roles in the family that she's going to abandon any of her ambitions. Even though she worked to put him through law school, she doesn't get her turn, but she doesn't want it. And that's why it's made okay in the movie. But all these audiences still get this safe, secure ending with the notion that, well, he's progressive, he wants her to go to school, and I like him so much in the scene where he's right before he learns that she has a terminal illness.
He learns before she does.
There's 1970 for you that the doctor's like, don't tell her, but she's dying.
Wasn't that what happened in Mad Men too?
Yeah, it happens in Mad Men. I forget the name of the movie, The Farewell, the Awkwafina movie, where the grandmother's dying, but they don't tell her, and the whole family fakes a wedding to say goodbye to her without telling her. Yeah,
that's the plot line, isn't it? Yeah.
Based on a true story, because apparently they still do that in some countries. I think it's China in that movie.
She's older. That makes a little bit more sense, I think.
I guess, but it's really patronizing. They treat her like a child. But in that scene, he gets this throwaway line that doesn't really matter, but it's definitely communicating something to the audience. He says, whose fault is it that we can't have children? Oh, well, it's Jenny's fault. He immediately says, okay, we'll adopt.
Yeah.
He doesn't care. He just loves her. That's a fantasy. These two people love each other so much.
The only thing that split them apart is death. He would never have left her. He takes a stand against his dad and doesn't want anything from his dad. My original nutshell was all about that. But I wanted to go with the one I went with instead. But I can do basically what it was right now, which is, Dad, if you don't like her, not good enough for you because she's Italian and she's poor or comes from a poor background, then I'm out. I don't want anything from you. Except the expensive fancy car. And when I'm really desperate, I'll go to you for money and expect you to give me $5,000, which is a lot of money in 1970. And I won't even tell you why. But otherwise, I'm going to do it on my own.
Presumably, his father is the reason he got into Harvard in the first place. It doesn't seem like he's such a great student.
Well, he just finished third in Harvard Law, so he's
once he goes to law school, and it's her influence that gets him to study
He's working hard.
Yeah, he's not a studier. He's not like a really good student until he meets her. Yeah, her influence.
Because he has to, because this is going to be his future and his career, and it means a lot to her, of course, too, that he has a good job. They want to have a good life together.
And he seems to want her to be proud of him, more so than his dad. He rebels against his dad, but her being proud of his studying is what motivates him.
So I mock that about, Dad, I'm rebelling, somewhat, stuff. But it is good that you see that they do struggle because he has these crappy jobs. He's selling Christmas trees in the winter. He's cleaning boats and he's covered in dirt in the summer. Fixing boats, I guess, whatever. But he's working on boats in the summer, Christmas trees in the winter. He's not doing the kinds of jobs that he ever would have done before. If his father found out about that, he would have been appalled. But then he's the one that also said, if you leave, you're done. It's really Oliver, the fourth, Ryan O'Neal, who's more strong about that. The phone call comes about Dad's 60th birthday party. I want nothing. I'm not going to say another party.
The only fight they ever had.
But starts the fight when she goes off. And he's storming through the school to try to find her. And then she says the infamous line when she's crying her eyes out. So at least there's that authenticity feeling as well for real people, not so much from movies. Because movies don't even now show that sometimes very well. These two do go through something. But then again, look at the place they get in Boston, though, too, when he's cut off from his dad. He has the car
and they're like, what a dump.
There's a lot of space.
That place probably is $3,000 a month now.
At least.
Plus utilities. Mm-hmm. It probably was realistic, or at least close to it for the 70s, but it's pretty hard to watch this now and think, so on a teacher's salary and she's paying his tuition to Harvard Law School, which surely now costs more than a teacher makes in a year.
Well, he's
Probably
contributing something. He has those other jobs.
There's a fantasy, being able to pay for your education with some summer jobs.
Well, you could. Look at those jerk-offs who are 70 years old in Congress and the Senate who said,
I flip
I put
burgers."
myself through school flipping burgers. Yeah, you could do that when you were 20 or 15 years old, whatever. 50 years ago, dummy. Sure, things have changed, obviously. Well, that's the same thing here.
He seems to gripe about his jobs, but you do have to give him credit that he doesn't really get that down. For the first time in his entire life, living like a true working class life. He's just happy to be with her. He may not like his job, but clearly they are happy. And you do get the impression these are the salad days. They think they say something like, oh, one of these days we're going to look back and laugh. Well, let's hope that comes sooner rather than later. Ha 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 ha. But they are laughing. They are happy. Yeah. And he is proud of her and what she does.
What if Eric Siegel, who wrote this, or Hiller directing it or whatnot, if they were thinking that had she lived, never got cancer, whatever she has, leukemia, had she lived to be 50 at least, probably more like 75 years old, and he was with her and they never got divorced, that they're implying that when they looked back at their life, and obviously they would have had a pretty decent life in New York with him working at a pretty prestigious law firm like that, they would have been fine. If they would look back, though, and think, this is a great life. Our adopted kids turned out great. We have great friends. We're happy. We're healthy. Fantasy that they're healthy. But my best days, my best memories are the early days when we were struggling in Boston.
Doesn't everybody
and I was dirty.
Say that? Yeah.
So I think that's what maybe they're suggesting here is that that's all he has to remember her with. Well, there's a little bit of time in New York when they've got money and they've got a nice place to live, but not that long before she gets sick. But I think they would look back at that as the best days, and now that's all he can look back at, really, as the best days. He's not going to remember New York all that well because that's where she got sick. It's not New York's fault. I'm kidding about that earlier.
No, but yeah. He will forever associate his New York years with grief.
As far as he knows, she was fine in Boston. Maybe she wasn't. Where they have their meat angry. We've always heard about meat cutes. They have the meat angry.
And the movie jumps right into it. There is no foreplay.
One of the reasons, I was reading a lot of things, there's a ton of things on Wikipedia about this, and this was a good point somebody made. Maybe one of the reasons why this was such a big hit, repeat business is always a reason why movies are such hits.
When a movie makes this much money, people are seeing it.
And a lot of women will go back to see this many times, just like the Twilight movies and Titanic. But another factor is it's so short, they could run it so often. You could show this movie, 5 times a day back then? Maybe more than 5 times a day. It's an hour and 40 minutes long. And the sequel is about an hour and a half. It wasn't so successful, but that helps when you make a movie that's that quick.
One of the rare movies where I feel like they needed to lay up on the pacing. It needed so many moments to breathe that it didn't get, especially
maybe that's one reason it didn't make us
beats.
cry. Yeah, maybe that's why it didn't make us cry.
Especially the end when she's sick. That should be the whole last act of the movie. I think of something like Terms of Endearment.
They did that very well in that movie.
They did it so well. I mean, I thought about Terms of Endearment when I was thinking about this movie, even though it's not a romance, but it's a similar story that takes place over many years, and it's about a relationship between two people, just a mother and a daughter instead. And she dies in the end, she gets sick, but they draw out her death. It's not even drawn out. I don't think it's overdone whatsoever. It's not modeling. Steel Magnolias is another one where a death is important at the end, and you just have enough time to breathe and sit with that moment and watch the other member of the dyad that you're paying attention to suffer and grieve and stress about it.
Shirley MacLaine and Sally Field in those two examples.
We're crying for them the whole time. Meanwhile, Love Story, it happens so fast. Talk about her performance. When she's telling him, listen, I went to the doctor and I know I'm dying, she has the exact same tone and mannerisms as the way she says everything else.
It's like she got the
movie.
bread rather than him going to get the bread.
Yeah.
I got the groceries, took care of it. No, I found out I'm dying.
I paid the bills. Yeah, I know I'm dying. She seems to have no reaction at all. His performance is so much better than hers, and he shows a real vulnerability in
He's
the
gut shot when he
movie.
finds out. He walks down the street, finds out about that from the doctor, goes home and pretends everything's fine because she doesn't know it yet. And then at the very end, which we see at the very beginning, so it ties itself together. But at the very end when he walks off to that, where he skated, I guess is what it was, right? It looks like it's a baseball field, but I guess it's a hockey rink.
Hockey rink, yeah.
It's the beginning and the ending, it's the same part, and he says the line about what do you say about a 24-year-old girl that died. He doesn't cry, but he sells the emotion. I can see why people would cry about that. Maybe part of the problem is that he doesn't have anyone to play off of the way that in Steel Magnolias, that famous scene when Sally Field loses it, about Julia Roberts dying. All of her friends are around her. Give my daughter the shot! In Terms of Endearment. And also one of the greatest lines that Jack Nicholson's ever said in his life is simply, Aurora. McClane has a scene with him. The whole point is he knew you'd be a good guy. In other words, you showed up. It's that line in Jerry Maguire. You had me at hello. Mm-hmm. That line, of course, just means you walked in the door. That was enough. You don't need to say these other things. That was enough. This movie doesn't have anything like that because he doesn't have anyone to play off of. He doesn't really have that much screen time with his friends. Tommy Lee Jones is, I think, in his debut, but one of his first.
It is his debut.
Okay, and he's one of the roommates. It's funny because it says Oliver's roommate, was it 3 of them? Ray, Hank, who's Tommy Lee Jones, and Steve. And yet, I didn't know you had 4 roommates in college, but it does say his roommates. Anyway, he's got some screen time in this, and he went to Harvard. He was in a class with Al Gore, and I think they were even friends.
Oliver is loosely based on Al Gore and Tommy Lee Jones. Al Gore was a smart, good student, but whose father was a member of Congress and a senator, and just a very hard bar to meet.
So what Oliver needed, though, was to have Ray or Hank, probably not Hank, because he and Tommy Lee Jones aren't that close in this, but whichever one of the guys he's closest to, Ray or Steve, or another friend he makes as he gets older, to play off of, my wife is dying and she doesn't know. He doesn't get that. Because this movie just wants to get in and out so fast. And
it truly is just about the two of them. It's amazing how unimportant other characters are.
Arthur Hiller was never the greatest director. I'll talk about his resume in a few minutes. Did make some pretty good movies, I guess. I'm not his biggest fan. Maybe he wasn't the right choice to direct this either. Or maybe Evans, who was still pretty new to being a studio boss, was too savage in the cut. Although Rosemary's Baby is long. Godfather is really long.
Say what you want. The movie was the 41st highest grossing movie of all time. We can sit here and say everything they did wrong, and they would be like, excuse me, obviously we did everything right. The movie made a fortune. It was incredibly successful, and there was lots of tears in those movie theaters. We may not have cried, and it's not our kind of movie anyways, but it was successful. You say, nobody else to play off. He doesn't have anybody else to talk to in that scene. I guess they could have lingered on the relationship with her father.
He could have gone to see her dad as well before she actually is dying. When he finds out about it, he maybe should have gone to see her father.
These 2 people who are the only 2 people in her whole life as far as we can tell.
Yeah, she has no friends.
She has no friends. I think I said to you when the movie was over, it's appropriate to call it Love Story. It's truly about nothing else.
His hockey,
except their love. No, but his hockey only in relation to, she doesn't like hockey, but she likes watching him play hockey. His job only, and her job or whatever, everything just in relation to how the other person reacts to it. They truly just pay attention to one thing and one thing only, and that is their love. Their love is such a fantasy. They never leave the honeymoon phase. This movie takes place over, 5 years?
Yeah, she occasionally calls him preppy after they've gotten truly serious and then get married. But early on, that is a bit of a slagging nickname. It'd be like calling me fatty, I guess.
It's a defensive nickname because she's calling him what makes him, quote, better than her. She's calling him preppy because his preppiness is the reason she doesn't believe he will ever take their romance seriously.
But I'm saying that she rarely calls him that when they get together anymore. It's not like she always called him that. Usually it's Ollie or Oliver. Every once in a while, maybe in the last half of the movie, she calls him preppy, but not often because by then she truly loves and respects him. It's not just love, it is respect as well.
It's love and respect, but it's also, I really think it's defensiveness when she calls him preppy. Yeah. It's just reminding him, I know you don't take this seriously. I'm not a fool. Every time she calls him preppy, I think that's what she's really saying.
She's Matt Damon's character in Good Will Hunting, and he is Minnie Driver's character.
Yeah.
That line that Damon has about how you went slumming once too.
Exactly.
And then he doesn't believe she truly loves him, but he's dead wrong. What about their last scene together? She says to him about how it's nobody's fault. He's blaming himself because he didn't let her go to Paris for the scholarship. I don't think he's blaming himself that she got sick. Not his fault, I don't think at all. How could it be? The scene's fine, but it could be better. We've made the point already. She's not awesome. And Di's beautiful.
I was kind of mad that she didn't get to go to Paris. You know what? I was mad that she didn't want to go to Paris more. I was mad every time she just happily sacrificed something.
It's true. There was never
her own independence.
That could have been a 3 or 4 minute battle.
Like, she has this huge personality.
Yeah.
And
she's a good music.
Just so happy to make her life smaller to fit into his life. Like we were saying about the conservatism. They're supposed to be bucking against all this tradition, but he goes to Harvard Law. Yeah. And she gives up her job as soon as it's convenient and doesn't seem interested in anything other than using her big intellect and talent to raise his babies. Well,
she does use her intellect and talent at music to teach other kids about music, so that's good.
Just to get him through law school.
No, but at least she's doing that. It's not like she's a waitress. Mm-hmm. So she's in her field in a way, at least. I'd love to teach kids things I'm interested in and good at rather than do the job I do.
First of all, you see that she's not just sweet with the kids. She's actually kind of hard on them. She holds them to very high standards.
I like that they call her Jenny, not Mrs. Barrett.
That's right. And it's an opportunity for us, again, as an audience, to see him being so sweet. There's so many moments in this movie where we just see him being the best. I think that's part of the fantasy fulfillment, too. I was reading somewhere recently that a lot of women's romance is really just the fantasy of a guy who's ceaselessly kind.
He loves watching her do it. When
he just loves her. He loves that she's smart and talented, that she's the way she is with the kids. And you see him just mooning over her, watching her at work. I think being admired is a fantasy, and that's part of what the appeal of this movie was. Twilight, to bring that back. He just loves her so much. He watches her sleep, and he wants to not give up being a vampire. Although at some point I think that is part of the thing, but...
No, she gives up being a human.
She gives up being a human in the end. She's the one that makes the sacrifice to meet him where he's at.
Well, that's a little different. She has no choice there. He's superhuman, or he's supernatural. Can't change that.
Fine. I can't believe we're arguing about...
Yeah, who cares about Twilight? Move on.
Yeah, exactly. They scratch the same itch.
Oh, one thing I want to say about that, by the way, I thought about when you were making the point earlier about a person giving up something for someone they love. I probably made this point before, but it really applies here. Two of my best friends in college, Pat and Lynn, so they were new to each other when we all went to college, and they met and fell in love in that first year, and they got married a couple years after we all graduated. They have 3 kids together. They're still together. They've been together all this time. So 1994, probably when they first got together, and now here it is, 2025. I said to Lynn when I had the opportunity, because I've been wondering for years, you were one of our best students when we were all in school, and yet you gave up your career to be a mother. And I just said in the best way I could, why? And it's because she wanted that more. Pat didn't pressure her to do that. Her parents didn't. Or if they did, she was being polite, but I knew her pretty well back then. I feel like I was getting the straight goods, which was, I wanted this more now. Sometimes things change for people, especially when they see that little baby come out, man or woman. Mm-hmm. So it could be that with this character.
It's way more often
she had no
woman.
baby.
Yeah, I know.
No, I know. And they had no baby.
Sometimes it changes, but it's so funny how it's never the man that's like, I actually want to raise my child more than I want to have a career. Know. For some reason.
I'm just saying that I have an example of somebody that said, I'd rather do this thing.
I think lots of women say that. I think there's a lot of socialization.
But I know somebody. That's my point. And by the way, O'Neill learned how to skate for this movie.
Oh, wow.
Although not...
They had a double. They did have a double for some of those.
He's not skating all that much, but he's skating some of it. And she learned how to play. Yeah. And she learned how to play the piano. We see her hands on the piano, so she has to know at least some of it.
So another scene where he's mooning over her, just admiring her so much, playing the harpsichord.
I guess I talked about her credits, not that many of them. The Getaway with McQueen a couple years later. And this was her second film, and she was married to Evans. O'Neill, I talked about his credits too, didn't I? Paper Moon, What's Up Doc, Barry Lyndon, all in a short period of time there. And he's kept working. He died, I believe. He was working for a long time, but those are big movies in the 70s. Many stars at the time, and up-and-comers too, turned the role down. Or the up-and-comers, I guess, auditioned for it. They didn't turn it down. Hiller apparently wanted Christopher Walken.
How weird would that be? Mm-hmm. I can't picture it.
I didn't know he was around in 1970. I thought he was in some movies in the mid-70s. I thought he maybe started acting in, say, 73 or 75, but I guess he was at least in probably New York.
Wasn't he a dancer back then?
He was a dancer. Yeah. I'd be interested to see that, but he doesn't have the looks. Walken's not an unattractive man, even in his youth, but O'Neill's better looking than he is, and you need good-looking people. You didn't think that O'Neill was a heartthrob, but he's a good-looking guy by normal standards. Maybe not
I can see how some people would find him attractive.
But look in that time frame. Nicholson and Hoffman and Hackman, they were all becoming stars, those other guys, and then De Niro and Pacino aren't conventionally handsome. After we'd had the years for so long of a Robert Taylor, who was an okay actor, I guess, but a good-looking man, which is why he had the job in the first place. Those other guys, Nicholson toiled for a long time doing other things before he became a star, but none of them were conventionally handsome. So we've got that time frame then, too. That Love Story is not an Easy Rider type of movie in that way, but it's starring somebody who wouldn't usually have had this kind of role. Maybe he would have. I think he's more conventionally handsome than you think he was. He maybe fits back in the 40s more than 1970.
I think it's probably the character that they were attracted to. If I met Robert Pattinson on the street, I wouldn't be like, oh, he's a 10. He's a Hollywood hottie.
Good-looking man to walk by, but not, oh my God.
Yeah, but the way girls spent all those years losing their minds.
Or Chalamet.
Chalamet, yeah. You fall in love with the character. I think people are attracted to a way bigger variety of things than Hollywood tends to sometimes give them credit for.
Maybe also, this was unusual in 1970 to have a male character. Yeah, he's young. He's not that much more than being a kid. He's probably 24, 25. I think he's the same age as she is. But anyway, having him be so emotional. He doesn't have a crying scene, but he's so heartbroken.
He's vulnerable.
And so many other characters in the history of Hollywood, John Wayne would have done this.
He wears his heart on his sleeve a lot. I think they said that in the audition process, that was what made him stand out. He would just be moony-eyed. He would just express those emotions without the ego getting in the way. And that's what they needed in this movie. And I think it probably is what helped push it over the edge.
The funny thing is, the person that won the Oscar that year against him and refused it was a guy who was playing a pretty typical classic role, played very well, George C. Scott in Patton. Now, he's playing a military guy, playing a general, one of the top generals in the whole army.
But incredibly macho and closed off, no emotions
No emotions
whatsoever.
at all, not like this.
Except anger, of course.
Yeah. So back to the cast. I'm not going to mention too many more people. John Marley, who does play Phil, the dad, doesn't want to be called Dad, wants to be called Phil, even by his own daughter. He was in Cat Ballou. I covered that a couple years ago, I think it was. Anyway, Cat Ballou, the Western with Jane Fonda. And he is the studio boss with the dead horse in The Godfather. Ray Milland, who plays the dad, I asked you when I was over if you recognized him, and you didn't recognize him, but he is in Dial M for Murder, which we covered last year. And he won the Oscar for Best Actor for The Lost Weekend, which we covered, I think, a couple years ago. He worked for about 60 years. And then Tommy Lee Jones, actually, well, we know who that is, of course, but look at the career he's had. We've covered him in The Fugitive, Men in Black, No Country for Old Men, and also Cobb on my sports movie podcast, Scoring at the Movies.
And I mentioned that he was one of the inspirations for Oliver, this real-life Tommy Lee Jones. Siegel said that it was the way that he was a jock with a heart of gold. Like
Tommy Lee Jones, heart of gold.
He was a jock who was a sensitive, good guy and didn't come across like that stereotypical athlete.
You can't really be an actor and not have some kind of sensitivity. So yes, he and I'd mentioned John Wayne don't come across as the emotional type. But if you're an actor, you have access to emotions that the average person, the average guy, probably doesn't. Even if you are John Wayne or Tommy Lee Jones. Arthur Hiller directed The Hospital. I mentioned that already. I think it was a pretty good movie. I saw it a long time ago. Silver Streak, that was another monster hit in the mid-'70s with Pryor and Wilder. And they did The In-Laws, which is a pretty well-known comedy at the end of the decade. So pretty good 70s for him, just like Ryan O'Neal. And I mentioned Scoring at the Movies, my sports movie podcast, which is defunct. He directed The Babe, the one about Babe Ruth, which Chris and I didn't love very much. Eric Siegel was like Ali MacGraw. She was only in about 8 or 9 movies. He was a writer for barely more than that. But Yellow Submarine, so the Beatles movie, he had a hand in writing that. And then Oliver's Story, he did have a hand in writing and maybe producing. Anyway, he wrote that, the sequel.
He was a professor as well, and he never made tenure, and he thinks it's because of the populism of these movies that he made and that people never took him seriously because, oh, he's a love story guy. And he was always upset that he never had that recognition that he was looking for as a teacher, as a professor.
Okay. The producer was Howard Minsky, so he was nominated for Best Picture, the Oscar. His only other movie that he produced, at least, was Jory, Jory, in 1973. But he was an executive. That's why he didn't have a lot of credits. He didn't produce very often for that reason. The movie's 185-1. We got the DVD from the Toronto Public Library. Cinematographer was Richard, I guess it's pronounced Kratina, Kratina. He shot Hair for Milos Forman at the end of the decade. He was also a camera operator on Midnight Cowboy the year before this, and Trading Places. We've covered both of those, and we've also covered, or at least I did, Blue Chips for Friedkin on Scoring the Movies. Chris and I did that years ago. And he could use a Steadicam in this. His movie looked okay, but that camera, a little wobbly. The editor was Robert Jones, so Robert C. Jones, actually. We've covered him a lot the last few years. First of all, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner? That was on the podcast a long time ago for us. But he often worked with Hal Ashby, and we covered Being There late last year, and I did Coming Home. Was that last year? No, that was 2 years ago. We're 2025, so that was 2 years ago. So we cut Days of Thunder as well, and The Babe, so Scoring at the Movies podcast there. And he won an Oscar for writing Coming Home, which I did a couple years ago, and he was uncredited writing Being There. And, of course, the composer, Francis Lai, L-A-I, but pronounced Lay, according to the presenter at the Oscars. He mostly worked in French films, not surprisingly, French guy, including A Man and a Woman and others that Claude Lelouch directed. That was a Claude Lelouch film, A Man and a Woman. What about the look then, the cutting, the music? Did you like the music? It's too much, but at least it's
too much. I don't know.
Because you hate overdone scores.
I hate overdone scores, and they just repeat that motif way too much. The editing, don't love it. Hal Ashby I also find has some pretty awkward cuts, awkward transitions between scenes, and this movie is full of them. It looks great, though. I think so much of it looking great is just gorgeous setting, gorgeous actors, all those outdoor scenes.
Boston's got character.
Yeah, so it's a very nice looking movie, at least.
What happens next? Well, there was the sequel that came out 8 years later. I haven't seen it, but it's good to know that he picked up the pieces and moved on from Jenny, just like she wanted him to. She says that to him in the hospital. I do hope he'll listen to his father if the apology was genuine, though. Forgiveness isn't easy, but it's easier to let things go than to continue to be mad at somebody. Believe me, I know this from experience. If somebody is really genuine about apologizing for something and they didn't do anything that was that bad, let it go.
I think it's almost like another bit of fantasy fulfillment of just how many young people want to stick it to dad. And they get to really stick it to dad.
But keep that car.
Like, yeah, keep that car. Stupid
and
car.
when I really need it, you're the bank.
You could sell that car and drive a beater, and then your wife wouldn't have to work two jobs, put you through law school. But never mind that. I agree that there should have been a reconciliation with his dad, which is exactly what she wanted too.
That's what the fight's all about. He calls, or somebody's
Exactly.
called. I think it's supposed to be the dad on the phone. And he won't take the phone. He won't take the call. And what is it? Stay out of my life, aimed at her. And that's why he's trying to find her in school and then finds her on their porch. I forgot my key. Crying. Love means never having to say you're sorry.
You can say, yeah, his dad is wrong about this one thing, but other than that, his anger at his father seems to be a little bit irrational.
He's mad at him before
Yeah.
the guy refuses Jenny.
But the movie just refuses to reconcile that relationship. And I think it's just a satisfaction of being like, yeah, well, she's dead. The last thing that happens in the movie, the next thing you see is him sitting in front of the skating rink.
Yeah, and the credits play at that point. And Ally McGraw is top billed, by the way.
Oh, wow.
Even though she was in only 2 movies at this point.
Well, she was married to the producer.
But that's why. She was the pet project. Okay, then. So our last thoughts on Love Story.
Well, I can say I've seen it now. I hope I didn't spoil it for those of you who love it and got something out of it. But this was never going to be a movie for me, even if it was more well done.
It isn't a bad movie. It's fairly well made. Just never connected with it myself, and obviously you didn't either. I was nowhere near crying, even when Jenny was dying. But I've seen this thing twice. I think that's enough. So that was how we saw Love Story. I'm hearing some booing. Boo! One of my favorites. You're so bad. You're terrible. We wish you a happy Valentine's Day this Friday. It's one of the dumbest observances on the calendar. But if it means something to you and your sexy loved one, then have a good time. Buy a teddy bear or give somebody a card that says, I choose you, or something like that. Maybe this is why we don't like the movie so much. We're pretty cynical about some of the cliched stuff that other people love. Old Love Month will continue on this podcast in 7 days when we talk about another story filled with people making moony eyes at each other. And this time we'll get all animated on you as we look at Disney's cartoon classic, Cinderella. The coming attractions trivia for Cinderella. After we review Cinderella next week, we will have covered all 10 of the AFI's choices for their animation category on the top 100 genres list. The genres list had 10 genres, 10 movies each, 100 movies. Not surprisingly, that list is jammed with Disney movies, 2 of which were made by Pixar, but that does mean Disney now too, because they bought Pixar. So what's the only one of those 10 that wasn't released by Mickey Mouse? Or isn't now owned by Mickey Mouse?
So for the answer to that question, check out our podcast about Cinderella. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to favorite or subscribe. There are hundreds of episodes available for you to check out.
644.
Yes. So if you like us and you'd like to support the podcast, the best way to do that is by leaving us a rating and a review, and go for it. Check it out. I'm sure tons of your favorite titles have been covered by us before. Another way to support us, and a great small Canadian business that we genuinely use and genuinely love, is to go to sparkplug.coffee/HYES for freshly roasted premium coffee beans. And that HYES will get you started with a 20% discount. You can find our podcast on YouTube. Our channel is at HYES Ellis, and we'd love to hear from you. There are a few ways to find us, starting with Twitter. I'm at Bev Ellis Ellis, and Ryan is at MovieFiend51. We're also on Blue Sky, which is where you can much more reliably find me these days, and that is Bev Ellis Ellis. Ryan goes by Ryan-Ellis. And our email address is haveyouveurseenpodcast@gmail.com.
By the way, credits says Tom Lee Jones. Not Tommy Lee Jones. It is funny that he's Tommy. Can you imagine talking to that dude and saying, hey, Tommy?
I know,
Or even
and like
Tommy Lee.
that he would get like a more boyish name as he would
Especially
go that
him.
direction. Exactly.
Robert Pattinson, maybe.
It's
Ryan
funny
O'Neal.
like seeing him in this movie where he probably was like 25 years old and he still looks like an old man. He still looks like a leathery, intimidating guy.
Yeah. Well, anyway, to end this, I'll say, love means saying you're sorry when you screwed up. And I screw up all the time, so you know how I feel. I'll say it. Sorry. Sorry.
That's better. Translated to Canadian. And cut.